I was bored in my job and I wanted to try something different. I never thought I would travel. I never had any real desire to travel. I felt like I needed to actually go to Rwanda. I felt it was almost like my duty to do that. My thesis was more specifically about gender violence in the genocide, so there's just a lot of really shocking stories about rape and how women and children had been targeted, and 1 million people were killed in 100 days. I'd written this big research thesis, but I'd never actually been, so I decided I wanted to volunteer. I'd never taught before, I'd never really travelled in the developing world anywhere at all, so it was just like a totally brand new experience. I guess one of the biggest moments was when we went to, they took us to some of the genocide kind of memorial sites, and probably the hardest hitting was they took us to this church in a small town called Nyamata, and basically 10,000 people had been killed inside this church. And for me, that was the moment where I really felt like, I'd arrived in Rwanda. There's holes in the floor where grenades were thrown in. They take you down underneath the church. There's like a room where there's lots of skulls. So, suddenly it's right in front of you. Like, this is what happened. Sometimes I'd look into the eyes of my students and just wonder, what they'd seen, because even though I was teaching at a secondary school, they weren't, students basically go to school when they can afford to pay. So in one classroom I might have a student who was like 12 and another student who was 24. Actually, in one of my classes I had one student and he was 30. And he wasn't even in his final year of secondary school. He still had 1 year left after that. And he actually stopped, he told me he actually stopped going to school in '94 when the genocide started, and then restarted at school in 2008. So he had this huge gap, but he was so desperate to get an education that and he was living in a boarding school with, boys who were 12 years old, 13 years old, but he was so, keen to get an education that he was willing to put up with this, and he was one of my best students, always hardworking, polite, and, so there was always these inspirational students. If Man United are playing, there'll be hundreds of guys crammed around this tiny television. And so my students were the same, and they were quite interested, obviously asked me questions, and one day they asked me who my favourite football team was in England, and obviously they were expecting, one of the big four, I think Arsenal, Chelsea, Man United or Liverpool, so I just took my piece of chalk and wrote on the board Plymouth Argyle, which was met with, just blank, confused faces. No one had any idea. But gradually I started to tell them about Argyle, and gradually every Monday they would start asking me, what was the score, and I'd have to disappoint them again and tell them about another defeat. But as time went on, a lot of them started to get interested in Argyle. Well, firstly, it's probably one of the most beautiful places I've ever been. It's known as the land of 1,000 hills, and they're not lying. I mean, it is just, hill after hill after hill, and it's lush and green. Just a really stunningly beautiful. There is a big contrast in Rwanda between, obviously intense suffering and sadness about the past, but then from my experiences also intense hope for the future as well. But that, from my experience, that's what I saw in Rwanda. the world needs to know about what happened because, you know, they were technically abandoned. And that always stuck with me. You know, my students were great students and I got to know them well, and you know, when they told me that, you know, when I was getting ready to leave, and that was one of their main messages, you know, show people the photos, you know, of the churches where people were killed, show them the photos of these skulls, these mass graves, because, you know, we don't want this to be another period of history that, you know, is kind of left in history.